Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. My name is Jeff Miliff. I'm a principal program manager in the Office 365 team, and we are going to be talking about Exchange Online migration and hybrid connectivity to Exchange Online as a way to ease the migration process and have as seamless of a migration to Exchange Online as possible. Just a little bit of background to get started. I've been working at Microsoft for about 17 years, a little over a decade of that directly in the Exchange team, working on our on-premises products around deployment and architecture and various related features. And I've been in a team within Office 365 for quite some time since then that focuses on critical escalations coming in from customers that are hitting our CEO or various executive levels. So it's actually really an honor for me to be here today. I love coming to these events because I get to talk to happy customers as opposed to unhappy customers who like to yell at me very loudly. First of all, just one quick bit of housekeeping. We are recording this today, video and audio. Because we're doing a video recording, I have very bright lights right in my face that make it somewhat difficult for me to see you. So I suspect we will have time for questions. You may have some questions that come up during the session. If you do, just wave your hand a lot to make sure you get my attention, because it may be difficult for me to see you. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Quick question for everyone here. How many of you today are actually already deployed in Exchange Online? Okay, a few. For the rest of you, I'm going to assume that you're on Exchange on-premises. Is that true? Exchange on-prem? Okay. Anybody coming from something other than Exchange, considering moving to Office 365, Lotus Notes? Any group-wise users? Anybody? IMAP? No? Okay. So mostly Exchange. Great. So why hybrid? We have a number of different ways to onboard data into Exchange Online. There's stage migrations, cutover migrations, lots of documentation on support.office.com about the various ways to get your data into Office 365. Hybrid is actually, one could argue, the most complex way to do it, but also the most seamless and potentially the most beneficial. So with a hybrid environment coming to Office 365, you have the ability to migrate at your own pace and potentially remain in that hybrid state for a long period of time. You don't necessarily have to. We'll talk about some tweaks to the hybrid setup process that certainly makes sense if you're just using it for migration. But if you're using it as a way to enable you to continue to have some on-premises deployment remain for a long period of time, you get some definite benefits around user experience. If you don't set up hybrid, you essentially have two totally separate Exchange organizations. Just as today, if you were to deploy 2 Active Directory forests and deploy Exchange in each one of them, well, you can set up cross-forest relationships with Exchange on premises. You have to do directory synchronization. You have to create some interesting linkages between those organizations in order to make things like FreeBusy work properly. Well, Exchange Hybrid is essentially the same thing, but between your on-premises deployment and Office 365, Exchange Online. So with Exchange Hybrid, instead of having a very negative user experience of someone on-prem trying to mail someone in the cloud and seeing their address pop up as just an SMTP address, or getting the mail tip that says that user's outside of your organization, are you sure you want to send mail to them? Or trying to look them up in the GAL and not seeing them there, the global address list, or trying to schedule a meeting and not seeing any FreeBusy information. Exchange Hybrid allows all of that negative user experience to go away. And you essentially have one Exchange organization from the end user's perspective that just works. Doesn't matter where the user's mailbox is. They can be on premises, they can be in the cloud. You can move them on demand if you need to. And when you make that move, you can do it in a way that's very similar to what you're used to today with the online mailbox move process that we have in, I'll say, modern versions of Exchange. Hopefully none of you are coming from, well, actually, anybody here on Exchange 2000? 2003? 2007? A few. All right, you guys should go to the next session about staying on-prem versus the cloud and older versions of Exchange. Okay, so for the most part, we're all on newer versions. That's good. So, you should be fairly familiar with online mailbox move and what that means for end users. It's a very straightforward, easy process that doesn't require much, well, ideally any interaction with your users as their mailboxes are moving around. So hybrid is a wonderful thing. It's been around since, I don't really want to say since the beginning of Exchange Online, but it's been around for many, many years. It actually started out as a white paper, a deployment white paper. We introduced that in around the time frame of Exchange 2010 Service Pack 1. It was 72 pages of documentation that described everything that you needed to do to set up hybrid and get it to work. Not surprisingly, we had very few successful customers that had hybrid up and running. At that time, the guy who actually was in charge of that hybrid process actually worked in my team, and we saw all of those complaints coming in, and realized that we needed to do something about that. Now, obviously, this is just software, right? The magic of software, we can automate things. We can just make the right things happen behind the scenes with a little bit of input, and eliminate the need to publish large documentation sets like that, and have you go through that pain. So in Exchange 2010 Service Pack 2, we introduced the first hybrid configuration wizard. So there were a number of wonderful things that went into that, and we reduced the amount of documentation required significantly, but there was still some manual process. In Exchange 2013, we actually made a very major improvement. And with Exchange 2013, there were a number of sort of application tools that came with the product that were used to manage the product historically that went away and moved into the browser. Same thing happened with the hybrid configuration wizard. We made some major improvements there around transport configuration that made it much easier to deploy hybrid. 2013 Service Pack 1, we added support for multiple Exchange organizations rather than just supporting a single Exchange organization being hybrid with a tenant. We also added support for Edge. 2013 CU5, we started adding support for Gallatin, which is our deployment of Office 365 in China, one of our sovereign clouds, as well as support for OAuth. 2013 CU10 and Exchange 2016, we moved to what we call the Office 365 Hybrid Configuration Wizard. Now, the Office 365 Hybrid Configuration Wizard is basically the Exchange Hybrid Configuration Wizard. It's not configuring anything other than Exchange today. But you can think of it as the place where we would automate other aspects of Office 365 at some point in the future. And then shortly after we introduced the Office 365 Hybrid Configuration Wizard for 2013 and 2016, we realized that the vast majority of the customers that were interested in migrating to Office 365 weren't on those versions of Exchange. They were on Exchange 2010. How many of you are on 2010 today? Yeah. So we added support for Exchange 2010 to the Hybrid Configuration Wizard, and that's certainly where we see the most interest in onboarding today. And then we continue to make further investments, and we'll talk some more about those in a few minutes. So one of the interesting things that we've done with the new version of the Hybrid Configuration Wizard is to take it out of the Exchange product itself. It's now totally, you can think of it as a separate product, totally self-contained. Those of you that have been with in the Exchange world for a while understand the Exchange supportability process, how we release updates, the cumulative update packages, the service packs that we release on a regular cadence. That, up until we started deploying things on the web with Office 365, that was very much the only way that we had to get new code out to you to take advantage of. And the initial Hybrid Configuration Wizard was serviced or updated in that same manner. It was part of the Exchange on-premises product. That's very limiting. It makes it really challenging for folks like me and the engineering team to think about a new feature that we want to add and get it out to you in a fairly quick time frame, and then get feedback on it and iterate and make it better and better and better. If that time frame looks like 3 months, 6 months, a year, it becomes really hard to make progress. So we got it out of the Exchange product as our servicing method, and we moved to a separate web-based release. So the Exchange on-premises product today has a link that points you to where you get the hybrid configuration wizard, and you go from there. So as an example of a great benefit here, this is a little anecdote that the program manager who owns the development of the tool put together. So we actually did a release. This would have been about a year ago, I believe, in this particular case. So we released the new version. Customers started seeing an issue popping up, and it was a portion of our customers, not everyone. Typically, if we release something to the web and everyone is seeing a problem that blocks progress, we'll very quickly start to get phone calls from Microsoft support. It's a very clear signal that we have a problem. In this particular case, we actually didn't get phone calls. But much like all of the features in Office 365, we have built-in telemetry that actually shows us on an ongoing basis how people are using our products and the experience that they're having. Every time you look at an email in Outlook or OA or any aspect of Office 365, you're contributing to a set of data that we look at on a daily basis to understand how things are looking. I'm not saying we're actually collecting like the email subject line or the recipients or anything like that. Think about the vast number of times those actions are happening, and there's actually really no way we could legitimately try and analyze anything beyond just aggregates. But we can look and see from day to day, as an example, the error percentages associated with someone sending mail via a particular method in OA. And if that changes day to day, then we have something interesting to go investigate and figure out what happened that caused that uptick or that reduction in error rate. When you have that volume of activity, those little blips start to become very meaningful. So we're doing the same thing with the hybrid configuration wizard and actually watching for problems in this way. So we saw that 33% of the failures that people were experiencing came from these two errors that were popping up. So this is from Monday to Wednesday, right? So we're talking about 2 days now. We actually already had log files that had been submitted by users as part of the feedback process, where you can go and say, did you have a good experience with the tool or not? Actually, sorry, I misread the slide. I misread the anecdote. So Monday, all of that was done. So on Monday itself, still on Monday, we've actually addressed the code flaw. Right? So we identified the problem, fixed the problem, built the new version of the tool on Tuesday. We are constantly building, but in terms of getting official builds out to people and posted on the download center, that doesn't happen immediately. We have to make sure that everything's good to go. And by Wednesday, we actually were able to see from our telemetry that everything was good to go, that we'd fixed the problem. And in this particular case, we actually saw no escalations to support as a result of it. And we basically took a 3 to 6 month development cycle and turned that into a couple of days. So we're loving the web. Anyone here actually run through the hybrid wizard in prior versions? A few? Okay. So our first iterations of the hybrid configuration wizard were not as useful, shall we say, when it came to troubleshooting. One of the biggest complaints that we've had historically has been the error messages. Actually, I think many of you started to see some of this with Exchange 2010, 2013, where a lot of the event logs that show up in the product have these gigantic exceptions, and it just sort of looks like the software kind of threw up into the event log. There's nothing very meaningful for you to actually do anything with. There's all this stuff that's essentially a call stack. There's a bunch of information about public key tokens and cultures and stuff that's absolutely meaningless to really everyone in this room, including me, unless I go pull open the source code and start to figure out where this problem occurred. So we finally have gotten rid of all that, and we actually give you a meaningful error message and actually point you to how to fix it, as we should have done to begin with. But The key here is that the hybrid configuration wizard, though in general, will take you through step by step and allow you to avoid problems. If you do run into problems, we actually do the right thing and get you fixed, ideally without having to deal with anyone at Microsoft to make that happen. We've also done some work around improving logging. I'll just leave it at that, just to say that it's much easier to go and dig into what the tool is actually doing now and understand that without being the software developer that created the tool. So I mentioned feedback. We actually do look at every single piece of feedback that comes in around this tool. And I'll jump into what that feedback has resulted in terms of improvements in just a minute. But if you actually exit out of the tool today, if you cancel at some point, we'll actually collect information from you on why you canceled, what the problem was that you ran into. And we'll give you the opportunity to provide your email address and let us know whether or not you want us to get in touch. And we will, in many cases. I'm not going to guarantee that in every single case we'll reach out and have a conversation. But if there are unique cases that are causing problems, we certainly want that information so that we can try and resolve those problems as quickly as possible. We love the verbatim feedback that we get. Some of it's awesome. We certainly love the occasional pat on the back. Like I mentioned, many of us deal with angry customers for the most part, so hearing good things is nice. Be aware that if you put anything in there that isn't so nice, we also see that. So sometimes we don't get nice feedback. Sometimes it's a little more direct. Not going to read those out loud. This is actually true of any place in Office 365 where you go, click the smiley face or any of those feedback links, and they offer you the opportunity to provide verbatim feedback. Real people actually do see that stuff, so just keep that in mind. So one of the biggest things that we've done through this process of collecting telemetry, collecting feedback, understanding the challenges that people run into around creating a hybrid relationship is that we now have a much better idea of the most common failure modes, the most common problems that result in not being able to complete the end-to-end process. One of the biggest being an external URL for Exchange Web Services. We need that for the MRS, Mailbox Replication Service endpoint that we're going to connect to perform migrations. Not everyone creates an external URL that's associated with Exchange Web Services, so we now do a great job of detecting that. We actually ask you, hey, we noticed you didn't have one of these created. Would you like us to just go ahead and do it for you? And we give you the opportunity to configure a URL within the tool, and we'll go set it for you behind the scenes. So the question was, is that only on Windows 2013 and up? You must be an Exchange. Yep. That would be on, yes, I'll say yes. There may be a caveat to that. So we look for whatever endpoints we need on whichever version you're running against, and we'll go and detect if anything's missing and provide you the opportunity to create it. So I'll just leave it at that. We also actually test it. So rather than going through and assuming that everything's good to go, oh hey, in Active Directory you have this configuration for an endpoint that we're going to connect to, you may not actually have that URL published to the internet in a way that we can get to it. That's actually fairly common as well. How many of you publish Exchange to the internet through reverse proxies? A few, okay. We've got some great blog articles that explain why you don't need to do that anymore, but that's for a whole other session. But if you're doing that, you likely have some rules that are limiting the specific sets of URLs that you publish to the internet. You may not be including EWS, depending on the clients that you have connecting to Exchange. That's one example of a case where Office 365 might not be able to actually hit that migration endpoint. You might not actually have the correct, load balancer configuration, depending on the version of Exchange that you're using in terms of affinity. There's a number of different things that could happen here. So we'll actually do a test to make sure that it's reachable. Before you go through the process of setting up that migration endpoint as a target in Office 365 and trying a migration. We want to be able to detect that problem now and allow you to fix it with the right level of help. Directory synchronization is absolutely necessary for hybrid. We need to actually have a representation of your on-premises users in Exchange Online in order to be able to perform that migration and allow those users to actually interact with each other. So in the past, you've had to go and manually, within the Office 365 portal, activate Directory Sync. And then you'd go and download what was the DirSync tool and is now the Azure Active Directory Connect tool and get that set up and syncing. So we'll now activate DirSync for you behind the scenes. And we've also historically required some additional DNS validation for the federation process in order to actually assure that the domains that you're using to set up that hybrid relationship are actually owned by you, much in the same way that you have to validate domains for transport and for identity federation in Office 365 today. Well, the interesting thing is you're typically using the exact same domains for all of this. You're already validating that you own those domains once for that identity federation or transport process. So you don't really need to validate them again. And we're moving to the point where you won't need to as a result. Any Office 365, sorry, Exchange Online dedicated customers here today? Okay. Dedicated, for those of you that aren't aware, is an offer that we've had, I'll say historically, that is more in line with what you might think of as traditional outsourcing of your Exchange environment to someone that's just going to run dedicated infrastructure for your organization in their data center. We actually kind of started in that business originally as more of a traditional outsourcer with a few very large customers that were essentially outsourcing Exchange to us sort of in the same way that our internal IT department ran Exchange for Microsoft. So that's how we sort of grew Exchange Online originally. We have a number of customers in that space today. And Exchange Hybrid is, the hybrid configuration wizard didn't make sense for dedicated previously. We're now moving those dedicated customers into what we call dedicated vNext. There's a number of different names for it, but it's essentially the same multi-tenant Exchange Online infrastructure that you're familiar with today, but in a more dedicated, focused way for those customers. They get to take advantage of some of the same the same advantages, the same deployment processes, the same new feature rollout schedules, et cetera, that we get for the rest of the service, as well as things like the hybrid configuration wizard moving forward. So we now have support for dedicated customers in the hybrid configuration wizard. So let's talk about minimal hybrid. This is actually one of the most interesting parts that we're talking about today. This is a big change that we've made in the hybrid configuration wizard in recent months. So sometimes hybrid, the full hybrid configuration is just too much. It's too much complexity. You don't actually need it. We have a lot of customers that deploy hybrid specifically to get their data to Exchange Online. Then they end up with this really complex thing that they have to maintain and monitor and ensure remains up and running so they're not seeing warnings that pop up in the portal or taking help desk calls for really strange client connectivity problems or something. And the only reason that hybrid relationship was established was for that onboarding process. And it never went away. We also run into cases where you go through the process of allowing FreeBusy to work between on-prem and the cloud, where you didn't actually really care about that, but you had to go through all the steps to get that configured. Really, all you wanted to do was just get your data up as quickly as possible, be able to do that in a seamless manner without doing a staged or cutover migration. But because the documentation said so, in order to really be a supported hybrid configuration, you had to go through that FreeBusy configuration, or you had to go through the secure transport configuration to get secure mail flow working. So what we did was create a solution for this set of customers that really just want to focus on migration, and that's what we call minimal hybrid. It's essentially the set of features that are necessary within hybrid to migrate data, and nothing else. We can configure those in a very straightforward, very, very easy manner. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. So this isn't for everyone, absolutely. And hybrid migration isn't for everyone. Stage migration might work, cutover migration might work. It really depends on how complex your deployment is, how many users you have, how many servers you have, the volume of data you're trying to move. It's really kind of about the volume of data that you're trying to move when you think about it. If you have a single server with 20 users, even minimal hybrid probably doesn't make sense for you, right? You can likely migrate that data very quickly on a weekend, and you may be able to take an hour of downtime for that cutover process, and your users may be able to manage reconfiguring their Outlook profile. Maybe not. But that's going to be a decision that each and every one of our customers are going to have to make for themselves. There's no simple, straightforward way that I can make a proclamation for what makes the most sense. But let's look at what minimal hybrid looks like. Actually, before I do that, real quick, how many of you who are thinking about doing this would use minimal hybrid? You don't actually really care about FreeBusy. You're just trying to get all your data up to Office 365 as fast as possible. Okay, a few. So this is what minimal hybrid looks like if you configure it in the tool. So we open the hybrid configuration wizard, we click on Next. Hybrid config wizard, assuming that it's running in your the AD forest where your Exchange deployment lives, it'll go detect a server that it can connect to. You give it some credentials to use remote PowerShell against that Exchange deployment, and you do the same thing for Office 365. You give it your tenant, some tenant credentials that allow it to connect through remote PowerShell to Exchange Online. We'll then make those connections, get some data from both sides to make sure that we understand what is and is not yet configured. And then we give you the option. Do you want to do a full hybrid config, or do you want to do the minimal config? We're going to click minimal. We click update, because we already know what changes need to occur. And we'll go through and, via remote PowerShell, on both sides, go update whatever configuration parameters need to happen that need to be updated in order to establish that relationship between the organizations. And then we're done. You tell us what you thought. Hopefully you have some great feedback for us. As I mentioned, we're going to read every one of these. And that's it. So what did we do? A whole bunch of stuff. We went and configured accepted domains to ensure that Mailflow would work properly. We set email address policies and updated any that were there to ensure that as we migrate users, those users are going to get stamped with the right email addresses so that Mailflow will continue to work both within your organization as well as to and from the internet. We configure remote domains, virtual directories. We go and I mentioned the DirSync enablement piece, so we'll go and make sure that DirSync is enabled behind the scenes so that you can install it and configure it if you need to. We'll go through and do all the endpoint detection that I mentioned and go make sure that the MRS endpoint is actually working. So what don't we do? FreeBusy, OA and EAS redirection. So what I'm referring to there is in a full hybrid deployment, if you go to Office 365 and, if you go to essentially the wrong side of the deployment and attempt to log in, we have the ability to redirect your connection to the right location. So your end users, as I mentioned, don't really have to know where their mailbox is. We'll get them there. We don't set up authenticated Mailflow. Mailflow still works, but it's not set up as a fully trusted authenticated connection. So important to call that out. Mailflow does still work between the organizations, but it's not as secure as it would be in a full hybrid deployment. We don't support, should actually say e-discovery, cross-premises e-discovery. So the e-discovery functionality that exists in Office 365 information protection won't work cross-premises. And the archive retention settings won't traverse cross-premises, though archiving still works. So as I mentioned, minimal hybrid absolutely makes sense if you're just trying to get your data up to the cloud. We have many, many, many customers give us feedback that one of the most painful parts of that process is having their users have to reconfigure an Outlook profile or resync an OST. If you're doing a big migration to Office 365, thousands of users, potentially very large mailboxes, given the amount of data we have in our mailboxes these days, that's a lot of data to have to resync down to an OST. And if you're migrating a lot of people all at the same time, that's potentially a lot of bandwidth that you may not have planned for with your internet connectivity to Office 365. So preserving that Outlook OST file and avoiding the need to reconfigure Outlook profiles is a very beneficial reason to go with minimal hybrid compared to some of the other migration methods. We get a lot of feedback that for merger and acquisition scenarios, this is a very useful tool. Essentially, get that acquired company or that merged company's data into the existing tenant for the acquirer as quickly as possible. We see a lot of people doing that. We do have some work to do around M&A, clearly. That's something we're constantly getting feedback on, and we're working on investments in that space to do better. Until we do, this is absolutely a great way to go. So let's talk about the end-to-end onboarding process, what it looks like, the different steps that you have to take to get your data into Exchange Online. And I'll call out that this slide actually may not be terribly accurate. It says today. I'd actually say that the word there should be yesterday. Heck, well, no, I'm not going to change the slide. Historically, the migration experience into Office 365 was sort of a classic example of Microsoft shipping its organizational chart. So there was an aspect of it that came from the team that runs the Office 365 portal, and there was an aspect of it that came from the Exchange team, and there was an aspect of it that came from the Directory team, and none of it really looked the same or worked the same or knew how to talk to each other, or even that another component existed in this space. That's what happens when you have a large company the size of Microsoft that tries to get things out to our customers as quickly as possible. But we know that that's not the best experience for you, not the best experience for our users. So we're constantly trying to improve in that space. So this is an example of what that historically has looked like. You go and add and verify domains in one place. Go and determine your migration approach. That's over often the help content on support.office.com or in TechNet or somewhere else. You go and configure your source environment. That's going to be probably coming from documentation that's in TechNet, where all of our on-premises documentation historically has been. And there might be some tools, the deployment assistance, things like that help you in that space. You go and provision users. Directory Sync, comes from the Azure Active Directory team. It, is sort of related to Office 365, sort of related to Azure, sort of sitting in between the two, but not really clear where it really belongs. You go and configure migration batches. That process is going to be different depending on what migration process you're using, whether it's hybrid, staged, cutover. And then you get your users connected. And depending on the migration method that you picked, you may end up having to, as I mentioned, recreate Outlook profiles. You may end up having to make DNS changes. You may end up having to reconfigure EAS devices. Hopefully not. That's certainly fun in a large organization. And really manage that process in a very careful manner, staged manner to get things working right. So what we're doing is trying to take all of that stuff and point you to one place. And that place is the Office 365 portal, the new Office 365 portal. There's now actually a migration option. I can pull up the portal in a bit if anyone wants to see exactly where it is, but down the left side of the portal, I believe it's the third from the bottom, there's an option for administration tools, I believe, and there's a section on data migration. And if you select that, we'll take you to a page where we ask you where you want to bring data from. And this is for all of Office 365. This is not just about Exchange. You can tell us you want to bring, from an Exchange perspective, you could tell us you want to bring data from Hotmail, or you want to bring data from on-premises Exchange, whatever other options that we're typically seeing people use for migrations. We'll have that information here. So what we actually do from an Exchange perspective, if you click on the Exchange option, is take you from right here to the hybrid configuration wizard. So rather than going to your on-premises deployment, opening up the Exchange admin console in your on-premises deployment, getting to the hybrid configuration wizard from the migration option there, rather than going to Office 365, now we're telling you, go to the Office 365 portal, tell us you're coming from on-premises Exchange. We'll take you to the hybrid configuration wizard, and we'll guide you through the process step by step, all within the hybrid configuration wizard. So that takes you, if you click on that, to the hybrid config wizard download page. You run the hybrid config wizard, and I showed you a minute ago what it looks like if you go through minimal hybrid. Very quick, very straightforward, just need some credentials, and we get everything set up behind the scenes for you. Assuming you don't run into any problems. But if you do, hopefully there's a readable error message and some good troubleshooting data that you can use to resolve that, or get in touch with us and we'll help resolve it. And then we deal with directory synchronization. So we enable directory synchronization as part of setting up minimal hybrid, but now we actually need to get directory synchronization working. So we don't actually go and install Azure Active Directory Connect behind the scenes. There are some things that Azure Active Directory Connect wants to ask you and wants to make sure of within their own setup wizard today. So we're not trying to abstract that away from them today. Hopefully we'll find a way to do that at some point and make this even easier. But we do ask you an important question. If you are going through the minimal hybrid config process and you have a small organization, you may not actually need to configure directory sync to synchronize on an ongoing basis. We may be able to just synchronize once, get a representation of all of your users in Office 365, perform your migration, and then there's an assumption there that you may not need that hybrid configuration to remain on a long-term basis. So continuing to synchronize directory data isn't necessary, right? You'll see when we get to one of the next sections I'm going to talk about why that's potentially a good thing, to eliminate that ongoing directory synchronization. I will say here at this point that once you establish that relationship and have directory synchronization running on an ongoing basis, you really need to make sure that it continues to run properly. It requires care and feeding. It requires monitoring, operational processes. And if you don't need that, then certainly don't invest in it. We don't want you to have that cost if it's not going to bring you a benefit. So from here, once you've chosen whether or not you're going to sync one time or whether you're going to establish an ongoing directory synchronization relationship, we'll take you to the AAD Connect process. Essentially, you install AAD Connect, then you come back into the hybrid config wizard. And if you've chosen to synchronize once, we will actually perform that action for you within the hybrid config wizard. So we'll initiate that synchronization for you, show you progress, and let you know when it's done. Once that's done, you have the opportunity to provide us with some feedback about how awesome the new experience was or anything that you'd like us to make better. And then the next step is actually to migrate mailboxes. At this point, you have everything that you need in order to move data up to Office 365. There's nothing else you need to do. So from there, we'll take you right back to that data migration section in the Office 365 portal. This is not the old method of having to go into the Exchange Online version of the Exchange Admin Center and create a migration batch and get things triggered from there. This is actually still within the Office 365 admin portal. We're not doing anything Exchange specific here. So we have those those users that have been synchronized through the DirSync process, either on an ongoing basis or one time, and we can ask, who do you want to migrate? Right? We now have all the information we need within Office 365 to initiate that process. So we do recommend that you don't just migrate your entire organization all at once. It's usually a pretty good idea to pick a couple of trial users, your IT staff, or I don't know, maybe you're into pain, so pick your CEO. Start with them. On a Friday, so you get called on Saturday. That's always the best way to go. But anyway, you pick a couple of users as test users, and you click on the Start Migration button. We do give you the option to automatically detect the endpoint that we're going to connect to. We do that through AutoDiscover. We'll go and look for that migration endpoint that's configured for your organization by doing an AutoDiscover lookup against one of the users that you're trying to move. Or you can manually override that. There are some scenarios where the EWS endpoint that you've configured is not necessarily where you want to go in order to migrate. A scenario that I'm dealing with on a regular basis is around ExpressRoute. Anyone here use ExpressRoute or thinking about using ExpressRoute for Office 365? Okay, if you are, definitely come to the cloud networking session later. We'll talk some about why that may or may not be a good idea. But for people who want to perform this data migration using their ExpressRoute circuit, which for those of you who don't know is essentially dedicated connectivity between your on-premises network and Microsoft's network, so dedicated bandwidth with an SLA behind it for that purpose. You may actually have your deployment set up so that the migration endpoint or the EWS external URL that you have configured is accessible via the internet. And rather than perform your migration over your internet pipe, you'd prefer to do it over ExpressRoute. So you could manually override with a different name that DNS resolves to an IP address that's on that circuit. That's the scenario that we see, or that I see most often there. So once you have that configured, and you can certainly use the automatic detection option, we're done. Right? We go and migrate the data behind the scenes. And when that migration is finalized, that user's mailbox or those users' mailboxes are now in Office 365. And Outlook will have a momentary pause where when that migration completes, they may end up having to restart their client. An admin has made a change that requires you to restart Outlook. Ideally, that's the most impact that they're going to see. So they restart Outlook. Outlook goes and does an AutoDiscover, realizes that they're now going to go to outlook.office365.com as their connectivity endpoint, and they get into their mailbox, and everything still works. That's it. That is what we consider a nice, smooth end-to-end migration process. Yep.
During migration, what's going on for the user?
So during migration, what's going on for the user? That's a great question. So as I mentioned, the migration process is very similar to the online mailbox move process. So essentially what's happening is the user is continuing to work against their on-premises mailbox. Behind the scenes, we are connecting and doing an initial sync and then some, you could think of delta syncs after we do the initial sync of that user's mailbox into Office 365. But the on-premises mailbox continues to work, continues to be accessible, continues to be unlocked so that the user can continue to do everything that they're already doing with it. There's a cutover process, a cutover phase where we basically, think of it as locking the on-premises mailbox so we can do whatever that tiny little last-minute delta change sync needs to be. And then once that's done, we make the right directory changes on both sides to say that now the real mailbox for that user is actually in Office 365. And that's the point at which they're going to essentially see Outlook need to reconnect to the right location, force Outlook to do that AutoDiscover process behind the scenes, and then get into their cloud mailbox.
Follow-up question, what happens with their phones, like a mobile device?
Yep, so the follow-up question is what happens with their phones? Depends on the phone. Some are better than others at dealing with that process. And so that's actually one I would argue one really good reason to test this with a small number of users. A lot of large organizations, well, I can't even make that claim. We see a lot of variance in organizations where some large organizations are very prescriptive about mobile devices. So the exact opposite of bring your own device, right? The company provides devices, they're all the same, they're all managed, they've made a big investment around MDM. Everybody has the exact same version of the mobile OS on the device, and it's all very controlled and very well understood. How many of you are in that situation? Okay, you're lucky. The 2 or 3 of you that raise your hands are lucky, because that means that you can test this with a few users and see what the experience is with those particular devices and figure out what you need to do to mitigate any impact that you see. If you're like probably most organizations on the planet today, you're dealing with bring your own device, and you have no idea what people are connecting with. In that particular case, I will say that for devices that are well updated, running as current as possible versions of their OS and or the apps that you're using to access on-premises Exchange today, the vast majority of those OSs and apps do the right thing when they have any sort of a connectivity problem with Exchange. In other words, they will go and potentially re-auto-discover, ideally re-auto-discover behind the scenes to figure out where they should be going. So as I mentioned with minimal hybrid, we don't configure minimal hybrid in such a way that it will do redirection between on-prem and the cloud for OA and EAS. So that's an important caveat here. Devices that are expecting some sort of a URL redirect are not going to connect automatically. They're going to need some manual reconfiguration. So some things will work, some won't. Hard for me to say globally for every OS and app that's out there today and all the different versions what will and won't work. So you're going to have to do a little bit of testing there, and doing a trial move process is the best way to get a sense for that. So let's talk a little bit about long-term management. This is another big pain point for folks who go down the hybrid path and use hybrid for migration or want to maintain some sort of hybrid relationship on an ongoing basis, or are coming to Office 365 from another product that isn't Exchange, like Lotus Notes or Gmail. So why on earth would we tell customers that are coming from Lotus Notes that they need to deploy on-premises Exchange in order to have a great experience with Office 365? Makes absolutely no sense, right? It also doesn't really make sense why we would be telling people to continue to maintain on-premises Exchange servers when the whole point of moving to the cloud is to reduce or eliminate your on-premises server footprint, right? And certainly any on-premises server deployment means that what you have to deal with as IT pros is more complex. You have more systems to manage. You have more upgrades to deal with. Patch Tuesday continues to be a problem. Everything that you know from your on-premises deployments continues to be a headache. So the challenge here is that when you have DirSync configured, you'll start to realize why I was talking about potentially just syncing your users once and then getting rid of DirSync. When you have DirSync configured, DirSync makes an assumption that there is one source of truth. And it does that for a very important reason. Having multiple masters of truth is a very hard thing to get right. We know this in the Exchange team from our old public folder architecture. Any of you on not modern public folders, legacy public folders? I hate that we call things modern, because what do we call the next version? Modern public folders? So legacy public folders had the concept of multi-master replications. You could have multiple copies of your data throughout your organization, and any one of those copies could be updated. And then we had to make a decision behind the scenes about who was right, assuming that, and deal with the fact that things could change pretty much simultaneously and run into conflicts. You can have the same thing from a directory perspective, right? If both your on-premises directory as well as Office 365 are considered to be a source of truth, how do we know what's right? You may have a bunch of processes that are loading data into your on-premises directory from an HR system or some other tools that are performing maintenance there. And you may be performing some sort of activity against Office 365, whether it's adding new users or managing DLs or contacts or something. You can run into conflicts. We now then have to have code that is very, very difficult to write in the right way to be able to manage those conflicts. So DirSync today has one source of truth, and that source of truth is on premises. It's not the cloud. If you have DirSync configured and you want to manage attributes on your email users, you have to do that via your on-premises directory, and those changes sync up to Office 365 via DirSync. There are a few caveats to that, right? You'll realize when you create that DirSync relationship and you look into some of the features that are available as part of Azure Active Directory, that there are some things that we will, what we call, write back. In other words, we'll take changes that are made in Office 365 or in Azure Active Directory and reflect those changes in your on-premises deployment. Allowing users to be able to do password resets, as an example, is something that is, in a sense, doing a write back, right? But in general, we don't move data in that direction from a directory perspective. So if you have DirSync enabled, Exchange Online mailboxes and mail-enabled users are managed on premises. If you're hybrid, and in order to be hybrid, you need to have DirSync running, at least doing that initial sync for minimal hybrid. All of those are managed on premises. If you disable DirSync, you can manage those objects in the cloud. So this is why you still need Exchange on premises. We removed the ability to manage Exchange attributes directly in AD users and computers many releases of Exchange ago, right? All of that is done through remote PowerShell or the Exchange admin console that's sitting on top of those remote PowerShell commandlets. Some good reasons that we did that. Role-based access control being the primary one. We were kind of, from a Microsoft application perspective, sort of the pioneers in the RBAC space. That's really implemented via that remote PowerShell architecture. And in order to get remote PowerShell on premises, you have to have an Exchange server. You can't just install remote PowerShell and the infrastructure that's required to make that work. You need Exchange. We do provide what some people refer to as the hybrid server license. There is no such thing as a hybrid server for Exchange. It's still an Exchange server, but it's essentially a free license for an Exchange mailbox server that isn't actually used for mailboxes or for end user access. It's used for this purpose of managing hybrid connectivity and being able to perform these administrative tasks. So this is where the problem comes in. So customers that are coming from Lotus Notes, as an example, who migrate their data, have that Lotus Notes deployment integrated in some way with Active Directory, who are migrating their data to Office 365 and want to be able to synchronize directory objects and manage those mailboxes once they're actually migrated to the cloud, do have to deploy an Exchange server on premises today in order to be able to manage those attributes. You can do it in Azure. That's another option. We do see some customers doing that, and I'm happy to talk more about that if you're interested. But just be aware that this is a DirSync limitation today. It's not an Exchange limitation. Quite happy to pass the buck on that one. Doesn't really help you, but makes me feel a little better. There are a couple other reasons that people keep Exchange around. And I will talk about how we're potentially going to fix some of this in a second. Hybrid public folders. So we do have public folders in Exchange Online today. There are some limitations around the scalability of that public folder deployment that you can do in Exchange. We're continuing to increase the supported scale of that, but it is a blocker today for some folks. So as a result, they keep their public folders on premises. You move your mailboxes and then just continue to use public folders on premises. Ability to offboard is another big one. How many of you would consider keeping a hybrid organization around just so you can offboard, just so you can easily say, oh, that user's having a bad experience. I want to be able to move them back down. Yeah, a few, okay. I hear that a lot. Less and less over time, and it tends to be kind of a trust thing for us. Running a cloud business is really all about trust. And as we continue to do a great job around meeting our SLA or exceeding our SLA and providing a great service, I think some of that will go away over time, but it's certainly top of mind for many people today. If you want that ease of being able to offboard someone just by right-clicking on their mailbox and saying, get them out of there, you need to keep Exchange around to do that. And then SMTP relay. Lots of folks have printers and scanners and random other Internet of Things devices, I don't know, refrigerators in your break room that need to be able to send email. Oftentimes you don't want to configure authentication for all those things to be able to send outbound SMTP, or maybe in some cases they don't even provide the ability to do authenticated SMTP. And in order to manage that, you typically end up having Exchange on premises to be essentially to manage that traffic, to have a connector that those devices can, an SMTP connector that those devices can point to and send their mail and route that through EOP, Exchange Online Protection from that point. So you have three options essentially in this space. You can keep Exchange and hybrid around. Certainly the best option if you're planning to continue to use any of this functionality on an ongoing basis. You can keep Exchange and get rid of hybrid if you're just using Exchange for recipient management. You don't need to keep the hybrid configuration around, because as I mentioned, this is about DirSync, not about Exchange hybrid. So DirSync continues to run. Exchange continues to be on premises, and you can still use that for your recipient management process. Or you can remove both Exchange as well as the hybrid config and just be a cloud organization. Now, our perspective on that is that is the cleanest, best way for you to go. We're kind of biased there. But I think it is certainly the cleanest. It's certainly the less complex of all of the options. It's just that not everyone can get there over time. So how are we going to fix this? There are essentially 4 attributes today that we can't manage in Exchange Online directly. These are the pain points for us that require us to continue to have this problem. So we absolutely could pick a source of authority for these that's different. We could say that those 4 things are going to be managed in Exchange Online, and we're going to deal with write back. And so if you continued to have Exchange on premises and you needed to manage those, we would essentially say in that case, the source of authority is now the cloud, and the only place you can update those things is in the cloud. That's not great. That's not a perfect answer. We could allow you to edit them in the cloud and have no write back, in which case you'd have divergence, where one directory could say one thing and another directory could say a different thing. That's not great either. Ideally, we want multiple representations of a user to have the same values. We could allow for multi-master. As I mentioned, that's a really hard thing to do right, I should say, to do correctly. And we could potentially have what we call a dual write option, which is where we allow you to, essentially we allow you to make changes in either location, and as part of making the change, we update both places simultaneously. Similar to multi-master, but a slightly different option. So we're still trying to figure this out, trying to figure out the best way to do this. We've been trying to figure this out for well over a year now. We will eventually get there. This is not, it may seem like a fairly straightforward problem to solve, but it's not. There are a lot of challenges in order to get this right in a way that works for every customer on the planet, and we have a lot of those. So for now, you kind of have to keep Exchange on-prem if you're going to have DirSync running. That's the key point. We'll get there eventually, but for now, you got to keep it. So a couple of summary points. We do think that hybrid migration does continue to get easier. I recall being part of internal conversations a couple of years ago with some of our executives who were were very anti-hybrid. They really did not like the idea that we were encouraging people to deploy hybrid because it meant that you were all going to continue to have on-premises Exchange and continue to run into lots of problems with those deployments. You were going to continue to have to pay to manage and monitor them, deal with all that complexity that resulted in pain, and bad opinions of our products. At the same time, we know that hybrid provides the best migration experience. So I think with what we've done around minimal hybrid config, we've sort of found a happy medium. Yes, there are going to be scenarios where it does make sense to have a full hybrid deployment and to continue to make that investment on an ongoing basis, to have users on premises and to have users in the cloud based on your business requirements and manage that appropriately. But with minimal hybrid config, we now have the ability to deal with the case where all you're trying to do is have the most seamless migration experience possible and do that in a very quick and straightforward way. I pointed out a bunch of investments that we made around trying to sort of put a lasso around all the different places that you have to go in all of our products to manage the migration experience, trying to do a much better job of just doing that within the Office 365 portal and the hybrid configuration wizard itself. Hopefully those investments will actually bear fruit and you'll see some benefit from them over time. And we are going to continue to do a lot of work here, primarily around that feedback that we get from the tools. So I joked around a lot about the feedback process, but do submit that stuff, particularly if you have constructive feedback about ways in which we could make things easier for your particular scenarios. Please do send that. We really would love to see that. A couple of last-minute points, and I'll take whatever questions you have. Come let us buy you a beverage this evening, 6 to 7 p.m. in Hall D1. I'll be there. All my colleagues that are here from the various product groups and our marketing and services teams will be there as well. And we're more than happy to answer any specific questions or even more general things about product roadmap or whatever you want to talk about. Please stop by, and we'd love to see you there. Normally at this point, I put up a slide that shows my Twitter handle and my direct email address in case you want to ask a question that I can't get to. But we're recording this. It's going to be live on, I assume, Channel 9 on the web for everyone in the world to see. So I didn't really want to give everyone in the world my personal email address. So I'm going to make it slightly harder. My first name at Microsoft.com. That's not that... that'll be fairly easy for people to discover anyway, but at least it's not on the slide that you can just skip through to the end and see. So if you do have a question that we're not able to answer here or at Ask the Experts later, feel free to drop me an email, just my first name at Microsoft.com. And if you don't remember what that was, no, I'm not going to do that. Jeff. There you go. Now everybody in the recording knows. There's no good way to do this. I'm more than happy to get in touch that way. Can't guarantee that if you have a complaint or something that I'm going to be able to answer every single thing that you send me. I can't take over for Microsoft support directly, but I will try and personally answer everything that you send. So with that, thank you very much, and more than happy to take questions. You're welcome. So the question was, what's the roadmap for public folders? Certainly looking forward to being on a recording for posterity about what our roadmap is for public folders, because we never change our mind on this one, ever. Public folders, for the moment, are here to stay. Having said that, if you look at where we're making investments in Office 365 around the types of things that you traditionally would use public folders for, so group collaboration type experiences, Office 365 groups is very much where we're putting a lot of our effort. We have certainly made some efforts around public folders and Exchange Online, primarily around scalability and being able to support large deployments, as well as the migration process of getting your data across. But when you think about the future and where, from an end user experience of, being able to fully take advantage of what we're doing in Office 365 with pulling all the different pieces of our products together and take advantage of those communication modalities in a seamless way. Now I'm sounding like marketing. I would argue that groups is a much better way to go for that. And I suspect you'll probably see over time an easier process to be able to get from things like distribution lists into groups, potentially public folders into groups. If you're using public folders today for, let's just say, other purposes, I've worked with companies that used public folders for very strange reasons, in very, very strange ways, other than the traditional design of I'm going to have a public folder for a project that I'm working on, for a team to collaborate within, those types of things. Groups may not be the right way to go there. And so you could certainly continue to use public folders for those purposes, but I wouldn't expect, I'll just call it innovation in that space. Wouldn't expect them to really get better or different or anything around that. Yep, you're welcome.
Two questions. First one, we're looking at doing the hybrid. We're currently on Exchange 2010, and we're talking to your fast track team about doing all this. But one of the questions that's not answered is that should I look at Exchange 2016 having on-premise first before I start to migrate to the cloud? Or should I wait, do the hybrid, and then do Exchange 2016 on-premise?
Yep. So the question was, I'm on Exchange 2010 today. I want to get to the cloud. I'm using Fast Track, which, by the way, anyone here not familiar with what Fast Track is? Okay, a couple hands. Fast Track is an offering from Microsoft that helps you onboard quickly. It's basically, you can think of it as kind of free support and consulting to go through that onboarding process. It used to be very much scoped to a particular size of customer, and that's grown very dramatically in the last year and a half or so. You can find out more information about it, I believe, at fasttrack.microsoft.com, but I would highly encourage anyone who's eligible to take advantage of it. It's a great offer from us at no charge. So on 2010 today, using Fast Track, moving to the cloud, and wondering whether you should upgrade 2010 to 2016. Well, we don't support upgrade. So deploy 2016, I guess, and migrate mailboxes, and then use that for your hybrid connectivity, or just use 2010 and then think about 2016 later from, I presume, a supportability perspective. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. I would probably argue that unless you have a very specific need to deploy 2016 and migrate now, that as long as everything that you're attempting to do is supported from a 2010 migration perspective, I suspect that it would be, then just getting off of 2010 into O365 now would be the way to go. You're going to move all your mailboxes? You're not going to... So some of them are going to be kept on-prem. Yeah, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. We should probably... Are you going to be asked the experts? Yeah. They may end up asking or forwarding your question to me. My team actually sits within the Fast Track organization, and we're sort of like the top-tier escalation path. So if there's a really challenging thing, we end up getting it. If you're to ask the experts later, we can talk more about it. There's a bunch of different decision points, or send me an email, and I'm happy to work that out. Yep.
Sorry, second question.
Yep.
We have an SMTP server
Mm-hmm.
to deal with, but no mention at all of mail for mail list of what stage then from where the mail comes in and where from the cloud and then the on-prem.
Yep.
What makes that go?
Sure. Okay, so the question was, why did I not mention anything about mail routing to and from the internet? That's my interpretation of the question, and where do you deal with that? So yeah, fair point. That is also a question that has a bunch of different answers, and if I'm going to talk about how seamless and easy this process is, it serves my purpose to not bring it up. So I did leave it out on purpose. Essentially, you have two choices. One of them is to point your MX record for your inbound email to Office 365, where it's essentially hitting Exchange Online protection. We're then managing anti-spam, anti-malware in Exchange Online protection, and then for your on-prem users, we'll send the data, the messages down over the connectors that are configured as part of that, either minimal hybrid or full hybrid config. Or the alternative is you leave your MX record as is, you have that inbound traffic coming to your on-premises organization, and we do the exact opposite. For users that you've moved to the cloud, we'll send things up to Exchange Online protection. Now, where this typically gets interesting is what you're doing for hygiene today. So for anti-spam, anti-malware. So if you have a solution that's sitting in front of your on-premises deployment that you're super happy with and want to continue to use, then we'll oftentimes see customers continue to point at that for their inbound email traffic, and then have things route up to Office 365. Usually, part of this conversation ends up being around, when you deploy Office 365, when you buy those Exchange Online licenses or those Office 365 licenses, you're already paying for Exchange Online protection. So, you bought a product that ideally you want to take advantage of. I tend to argue that the best way to go then is to have that be your first hop for your inbound mail. Let the service take care of that process, and then manage routing down to your on-premises solution. But that doesn't work for everyone. But again, there's a whole bunch of different decision points around that. The one thing that I will say there, it's probably worth saying for the recording as well. Under no circumstances do we really want people to have mail coming into an existing hygiene solution, anti-spam, anti-malware solution, and then going to Exchange Online protection as the next hop. There's really no point to doing that, because a lot of the logic that we use within these systems looks at where those connections are originating from. And in some cases is looking at header information that's stripped out by other products in this space. And so you end up with a solution, and this is not just an EOP thing, this is really any product in this space. If you layer them, I'm not going to argue that you get less protection, but there's very little point in doing so, because a lot of the information that we use for making decisions about what's good and bad ends up not being there by the time you get to the second thing in the layer. So don't do that. But in terms of where you're going to point, kind of up to you. Yeah, that's the easiest. All right, I'm over time, but I'm happy to take any additional questions that ask the experts or over email. So thank you all.